The following theory suggests that Darth Nihilus' speech could have been expressed as Force visions, especially given the unique nature of his connection to the Force and his inability to communicate in any conventional manner. Since Nihilus' voice was described as incomprehensible and destructive, yet somehow capable of conveying intent to those sensitive to the Force, it is plausible that his speech was less an audible phenomenon and more an expression of raw Force energy that manifested as visions or impressions in the minds of those attuned to the Force. If Nihilus spoke the raw dialect of the Force, his words would not adhere to conventional linguistic structures. Instead, they might bypass auditory processing altogether, resonating directly with the listener's connection to the Force. This would mean that instead of hearing words, Force-sensitive beings might experience vivid, dialogue-esque visions that conveyed his intent. These visions could take the form of symbolic imagery, overwhelming emotions, or even brief glimpses of the future, all of which would align with the Sith Lord's nature as a wound in the Force. Such a phenomenon would explain how those in his presence, such as Visas Mar, his apprentice, were able to understand him despite his speech being unintelligible to others. Rather than interpreting words, Visas may have received Force-projected impressions of Nihilus' will, allowing her to comprehend his desires and motivations. This method of communication would be particularly fitting for Nihilus, whose very existence was defined by his ability to manipulate and consume the Force on a massive scale. The concept of Force visions is well documented in Star Wars lore, with Jedi and Sith alike experiencing them as glimpses of the past, present, or future. Nihilus' speech, if tied to this phenomenon, could manifest as fragmented visions that conveyed his will. For instance, a listener might see imagery of worlds consumed by darkness, representing his insatiable hunger, or feel a profound sense of despair and emptiness that mirrored his own existence. These visions would act as a form of dialogue, allowing Nihilus to communicate his intent without the need for words. This theory aligns with the descriptions of Nihilus' presence in the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 video game, where his aura exuded overwhelming dread and despair. Characters who encountered Nihilus often described him as a void, an emptiness that devoured everything in its path. If his speech was similarly tied to his Force presence, it would make sense for it to manifest as a sensory overload of visions and emotions rather than intelligible language. Nihilus' ability to communicate through visions would also reinforce his role as a symbol of the dark side's corrupting influence. Unlike traditional Sith Lords, who wielded the Force as a tool to achieve their ambitions, Nihilus embodied the dark side's most primal and destructive aspects. His speech, if expressed as visions, would mirror this by bypassing rational thought and appealing directly to the subconscious, overwhelming the listener with raw emotion and imagery. This method of communication would further highlight Nihilus' separation from humanity and the natural order. While most beings use language to connect and share ideas, Nihilus' speech would isolate him, making true communication impossible. Instead, his visions would serve as a one-way transmission of his will, forcing others to understand him on his terms. This would make his presence all the more terrifying, as it stripped away the comfort of rationality and replaced it with chaos and despair. While the idea of Nihilus' speech manifesting as visions is speculative, it offers a practical explanation for how his intents could be understood despite the incomprehensible nature of his voice. Characters like Visas Mar would not need to decode his language in a traditional sense but would instead feel his commands through the Force. This would also account for how his presence could be so universally unsettling. His speech would resonate on a deeper, more primal level, bypassing language barriers and striking directly at the listener's connection to the Force. The possibility that Nihilus' speech manifested as visions further emphasizes his role as an anomaly in the Force. It positions him as a being whose very existence was incomprehensible to those bound by the natural order. His reliance on Force visions as a means of communication would reflect his detachment from humanity and his descent into pure, unbridled hunger. It would also highlight his inability to form meaningful connections with others, as his communication was driven not by dialogue or mutual understanding but by domination and consumption. Additionally, this theory adds a layer of tragic inevitability to Nihilus' character. If his speech was indeed a manifestation of the raw force, it would mean that his very voice was an extension of the void within him. He could not choose to speak differently or convey his thoughts in a less destructive way. His speech, like his existence, was defined by the hunger that consumed him. The theory that Darth Nihilus' speech manifested as force visions offers a compelling explanation for how his intents could be understood despite the incomprehensible nature of his voice. By bypassing traditional language and communicating through raw force projections, Nihilus reinforced his role as a being of chaos and destruction, unbound by the natural order. This method of communication not only reflected his separation from humanity but also highlighted the existential horror of his existence as a wound in the Force. Through visions, Nihilus' voice became a weapon, a manifestation of the void within him, and a symbol of the dark side's most terrifying potential.